Let's be honest, we've all had that taxi ride. The one with the weird music, the questionable route, or the driver who just won't stop talking. You think about leaving a one-star review, but it's never quite bad enough to bother. Well, the complaints we're looking at today are on a completely different level. These aren't just about bad service. They're stories of pure human absurdity. We've found 55 of the most bizarre and unhinged complaints ever filed against taxi drivers. 1. A complaint from San Francisco described a driver who was a fully committed, professional mime. White face paint, striped shirt, the whole routine. The passenger had to type their destination into their phone and show it to him. The entire ride was conducted in absolute, unnerving silence, with the driver using only exaggerated hand gestures to signal turns, indicate traffic, and finally to mime the total fare. The complaint stated it was the most stressful trip of their life. 2. The pine tree air freshener in one New York City cab was apparently so potent, it was making the passenger dizzy. But the complaint took a bizarre turn. It wasn't about their own discomfort, but a fear for the driver's safety. They were genuinely worried that the driver, who seemed completely immune to the overwhelming fumes, was on the verge of passing out at the wheel. The passenger insisted the company check on him, concerned about his superhuman tolerance for the smell. 3. This one is a new level of desperation. A driver in Los Angeles refused to end the trip until the passenger gave him a 5-star review, right there in the car. He literally locked the doors and calmly said, "We'll be on our way as soon as I see those stars light up." He even tried to coach the passenger on what to write in the comments, suggesting phrases like, "a truly extraordinary experience." The complaint was for, essentially, being held hostage for a good review. 4. A driver in Miami had turned his cab into a mobile sign-up kiosk for AliExpress. He spent the entire ride evangelizing the platform, with a tablet mounted on the dashboard permanently displaying his referral QR code. The real issue was the pressure. He kept insisting, "Just scan it, it takes 10 seconds, you're missing out." When the passenger politely declined to sign up under his code, the driver's friendly demeanor vanished. The rest of the ride was completed in a cold, resentful silence, as if the passenger had personally crushed his dream of earning a 40-cent commission. 5. A complaint filed in Chicago described a driver who refused to speak directly to the passenger. Instead, all communication was handled by a squirrel hand puppet named Squeaky, which the driver operated with his right hand. The passenger claimed the driver would ask for directions in a normal voice, but then Squeaky would answer in a high-pitched squeal. The final straw came at the end of the ride when the driver refused to take the cash payment himself, insisting the money be placed directly into Squeaky's felt mouth, as he was the official ride facilitator. 6. You expect a taxi to be a car, right? Well, one tourist in New Orleans was horrified when their requested ride showed up and it was technically a hearse. The driver assured them it was roomy, great air conditioning, and a very smooth ride, but the passenger was having none of it. Their official complaint mentioned that while the service was prompt, the lingering ambiance of finality was a bit much for a trip to Bourbon Street, and it completely ruined their desire to party. 7. A complaint from a freezing Chicago winter described a driver who refused to turn on the car's heater. When the passenger, who could see their own breath, asked for warmth, the driver calmly explained he was practicing intentional cold exposure to build resilience. "Comfort is the assassin of greatness," he stated, completely serious while wearing only a t-shirt. He then offered the passenger a small, flimsy blanket, explaining that this opportunity for personal growth was included in the fare. 8. A complaint from Chicago described a taxi that was essentially a rolling pawn shop for items left by previous passengers. The driver had a binder with a categorized inventory. Midway through the ride, he asked, "Are you in the market for a slightly used scarf? Or perhaps a single mysterious-looking earring?" He then tried to upsell the passenger on a half-finished book of crossword puzzles, claiming it was a great value for the intellectually curious. The passenger complained they felt trapped in a bizarre mobile episode of Storage Wars. 9. One person in Philadelphia complained that their taxi driver was a rogue botanist who insisted on pulling over every few blocks to take clippings from interesting plants he saw on the sidewalk. He kept them in a little bag on the passenger seat, lovingly misting them with a spray bottle. While the passenger appreciated his passion for urban flora, the 15-minute trip took nearly an hour, and they were late for a dental appointment, which they noted was somehow still more pleasant than that ride. 10. A passenger in San Francisco got a driver who was an aspiring and terrible stand-up comedian who used the ride to workshop his new material. After every painfully unfunny joke about airline food or online dating, he would kill the music, make intense eye contact in the rearview mirror, and wait for a laugh. The passenger complained that the silence was so awkward and charged with expectation that they eventually just started faking a loud, theatrical laugh after every punchline, which only seemed to encourage him more. What's the worst you've ever faked a laugh? 11. A tourist in Miami Beach was shocked when their driver had a co-pilot, a large, brightly colored parrot perched on the back of the passenger seat. The driver introduced him as Captain Bobo, head of security. For the whole ride, the parrot would let out a piercing squawk every time another car got too close. The official complaint was filed after Captain Bobo, apparently a fan of shiny objects, leaned over and attempted to steal the passenger's silver earring right out of her ear. 12. This one is pure auditory chaos. A rider in Atlanta complained that the driver had replaced his car's horn with a single, bizarre sound effect. A loud, dramatic clip of a goat screaming. He used it for everything. Annoying driver in front? Goat scream. Pedestrian crossing too slowly? Goat scream. The passenger's complaint stated that the ride was less of a commute and more like being trapped in a viral video, creating a level of public embarrassment they had never experienced before. 13. A passenger in Seattle lodged a formal complaint against a driver for being too professional. Upon entering the cab, the driver handed them a laminated card titled "Terms and Conditions of This Ride." The rules included no anecdotal stories longer than 60 seconds, emotional outbursts will incur a surcharge, and weather commentary is strictly prohibited. The driver didn't say a word the whole trip, simply pointing to the relevant rule on the card if the passenger spoke. So, what's the one rule you'd add to that list? 14. A complaint from a tourist in Orlando described a driver who treated the ride like a high-stakes scavenger hunt. Instead of asking for the address, he demanded the passenger provide him with the first clue. He then spent the trip offering cryptic riddles like, "We must now turn where the metal bird sleeps," to indicate the airport road. The passenger stated that while they eventually arrived, the mental gymnastics required were exhausting, and they felt they should have been paid for their participation in his bizarre, unsolicited escape room. 15. A rider in New York City filed a complaint against a driver who appointed himself the passenger's unofficial life coach. The customer was on the phone, having a quiet, tense conversation with their partner. After they hung up, the driver, who had clearly been listening to their side of it, turned around and said, "Look, I'm just going to say it. You're the problem here. You're not listening, you're just waiting to talk." He then spent the rest of the ride offering unsolicited, brutally honest feedback on what he perceived were the passenger's life failings. 16. In Las Vegas, a passenger complained that their driver was an unsolicited and frankly terrible psychic. Midway through the ride, the driver suddenly grabbed the passenger's hand at a red light and began reading their palm without permission. He then delivered a stunningly vague prophecy about an upcoming decision involving a purchase of some kind. The real issue, and the reason for the formal complaint, was that at the end of the trip, the driver tried to add a $15 spiritual insight fee to the final fare. 17. A writer reported a driver in Denver who, after 5 minutes of silence, turned and asked, "What is your single biggest regret, and what have you done to atone for it?" He then refused to continue driving until the passenger gave him a satisfactory and sincere answer. The passenger complained that they were essentially held emotionally hostage, forced to invent a soul-crushing regret just to get to their hotel, turning a simple fare into an unwanted and deeply uncomfortable therapy session. What's the weirdest question a stranger has ever asked you? 18. This complaint is a masterclass in pettiness. A passenger in Phoenix complained that the driver had a personal, almost violent vendetta against the car brand Kia. Every time he saw one on the road, he would mutter insults under his breath, shake his head in disgust, and briefly tailgate it. He even took a longer, less efficient route because, as he explained, his usual shortcut was too emotionally taxing due to a Kia dealership being on that street. 19. A passenger in Miami filed a complaint because the taxi was, in their words, a moving nightclub for plants. The back seat was lined with potted ferns, the dashboard was covered in succulents, and a small disco ball hung from the rear-view mirror, casting little dots of light on the leaves. The driver explained it was to help with their photosynthesis party, but the passenger complained that a fern kept hitting them in the face on every right turn, and the humid, earthy smell was overwhelming. 20. A complaint from a business traveler detailed a driver who insisted on optimizing the passenger's posture. At every red light, he would turn around and critique their sitting position, offering unsolicited advice like, "You're slouching, that's compressing your success chakra," and "Align your shoulders with the headrest to project authority." He even tried to hand them a small lumbar pillow. The passenger insisted he just wanted a ride, not a full ergonomic assessment from a man who called himself a posture guru. What is the most absurd advice you have ever received from a taxi driver? 21. A passenger in San Diego reported a driver who was a self-proclaimed brand consultant and spent the entire ride critiquing the passenger's online presence. The driver had apparently looked up the passenger's name from the app booking, found their social media, and was now offering unsolicited advice like, "Your LinkedIn profile picture is too friendly. It doesn't scream disruptor." And "You're posting too many pictures of your dog. It dilutes your personal brand." The complaint was for the creepy invasion of privacy, topped off by the driver handing them a business card for his Synergy services at the end. 22. A complaint from a passenger heading to a job interview described a very specific form of psychological warfare. For the entire trip, the driver made intense, direct, and unbroken eye contact with them through the rearview mirror. No talking, very little blinking, just a relentless, unnerving stare. The passenger said it was so unsettling that by the time they arrived, their confidence was completely shattered, and they were a nervous wreck for the interview. 23. A passenger leaving a late-night bar in Chicago got a driver who treated his cab like a mobile confessional. After a few minutes of unnerving silence, he turned and asked, "Is there anything you wish to unburden yourself of, my child?" The passenger, who just wanted to get home and eat a slice of cold pizza, complained about the sheer, suffocating awkwardness of the entire experience. What's the most awkward silence you've ever had to share with a stranger? 24. An aspiring actor in Los Angeles was using his taxi as a rolling rehearsal space. The passenger complained that for the entire ride to LAX, the driver performed a one-man version of a dramatic courtroom scene, playing both the fiery prosecutor and the weeping witness. The issue wasn't the volume, but that the driver kept trying to use the passenger as a scene partner, pointing at them and shouting, "Objection!" every time they tried to check their phone or look out the window. 25. A writer in Philadelphia complained that the entire taxi was a rolling tribute to Jackie Chan. The air freshener was a miniature figure of him in a mid-kick pose, and a dashboard screen played a silent, looping montage of his most dangerous stunts. The complaint was filed after the driver became audibly disgusted when the passenger couldn't name Jackie's co-star in Rush Hour, and then subjected them to a deeply disappointed silence for the remainder of the trip. 26. A woman in Los Angeles complained that her driver was a guerrilla fashion critic. After picking her up, he immediately remarked that her jacket wasn't working for her. At a red light, he turned around with a lint roller and tried to fix her outfit, insisting that presentation is everything in this town. The passenger felt less like she was in a taxi and more like she was in a surprise, high-stress reality TV show intervention she never signed up for. 27. A complaint from Houston sounds like a major fire hazard. The passenger reported that the driver had a small, electric hot plate plugged into his dashboard and was actively sautéing shrimp and garlic on the passenger seat for his dinner. The smell was overwhelming, and the passenger spent the entire ride on the freeway watching sizzling butter splash perilously close to the upholstery, torn between hunger and a legitimate fear for their life. What's the wildest thing you've ever seen someone do while driving? 28. Some drivers are too chatty, some are too quiet. But one driver in Miami was apparently too rhythmically gifted. A customer complained that the driver tapped his fingers on the steering wheel perfectly in time with every song on the radio, from salsa to classic rock. The passenger claimed this incessant, flawless drumming was so mesmerizingly impressive that it made them feel deeply insecure about their own lack of musical talent, turning a simple ride to the airport into a full-blown crisis of self-worth. 29. A complaint from a student in Boston described a form of psychological torture. The driver played a single, obscure German polka song on a loop for the entire 35-minute ride across town. It wasn't loud, it wasn't offensive, it was just the same relentlessly upbeat, accordion-heavy tune, over and over and over. The passenger wrote in his complaint that by the end of the trip, he was questioning his own sanity and the very nature of reality. 30. A business traveler in Atlanta filed a complaint about a driver who fanatically refused to make left turns. He explained it was part of a complex logistical efficiency strategy he'd developed. This meant that a simple trip that should have taken 10 minutes turned into a 25-minute labyrinth of right turns, U-turns, and circling entire blocks, all while the driver smugly explained how he was beating the system. What's the most ridiculous rule you've ever had to follow? 31. This driver in Seattle saw himself as less of a driver and more of an affirmation artist. The passenger complained that the entire ride was a relentless stream of overly specific compliments. It started with, "That's a very decisive way to close a car door," and escalated to, "The thoughtful cadence of your breathing suggests you are a natural problem solver." The passenger felt less complimented and more like they were being psychologically analyzed by a man who had read one too many self-help books. 32. A rider in Austin, Texas, filed a complaint against their driver not for bad driving, but for being a truth-teller of inconvenient proportions. Apparently, the passenger casually mentioned they were heading to a life-changing yoga retreat. The driver then spent the entire 25-minute ride systematically explaining, with supporting evidence from various online articles he had read, why yoga was a glorified stretching class for the financially comfortable, and that true enlightenment comes from accepting the beautiful chaos of a Waffle House at 2 in the morning. 33. A rider in New York City complained that the taxi was aggressively clean, but in a deeply unsettling way. The driver had every surface covered in clear plastic wrap, and he made the passenger put disposable booties over their shoes before getting in. The real issue was that when a single stray hair fell from the passenger's coat onto the seat, the driver pulled the car over, let out a long, theatrical sigh, and silently cleaned it up with a tiny handheld vacuum, all while staring at them in the rearview mirror. 34. A passenger in Portland complained that at the end of the ride, the driver refused to accept any form of modern payment. Not just credit cards, but cash as well. He insisted on bartering. He saw the passenger's bag of groceries on the back seat and offered to trade the entire $16 fare for about half of that sourdough loaf and maybe 3 of those organic apples. The passenger had to argue for 10 minutes to convince the man to just take his money. 35. This one is pure psychological warfare. A rider in San Francisco complained that the driver had a hidden speaker in the car that would periodically emit a single quiet meow. Every time it happened, the passenger would ask, "Did you hear that?" The driver would just look back with a completely blank, confused expression and say, "Hear what?" The passenger claimed that by the end of the trip, They were genuinely starting to question their own hearing and sanity. 36. A complaint from Portland described a taxi that was less of a car and more of a mobile terrarium. The entire dashboard was a living moss garden. Vines hung from the ceiling, and a small, burbling water feature sat where the center console should be. The driver called it his biocab. The passenger complained that the air was so damp it fogged up their glasses, and they were almost certain that a live frog had jumped onto their shoe at a stoplight. 37. A passenger in Chicago filed a complaint against a driver with a very specific and debilitating phobia: the color yellow. This was, of course, a major problem in a city filled with yellow taxis, yellow school buses, and yellow traffic lights. Every time he spotted the color, he would physically flinch and make a sudden sharp turn down a side street to avoid it. The passenger wrote that the simple trip felt less like a commute and more like a high-speed, color-induced anxiety attack. 38. Imagine getting into a cab and finding the driver has replaced his GPS with a magic 8-ball. That's exactly what a passenger in Portland reported. Every time they came to an intersection, the driver would shake the ball, ask, "Should we turn left?" and then follow its advice. The passenger's complaint stated that while they eventually reached their destination, the ride involved 3 unnecessary U-turns and a brief, terrifying detour through a farmer's market because, according to the driver, signs point to yes. 39. A complaint from Austin detailed a ride filled with a strange, low-frequency hum. The driver proudly explained it wasn't an engine problem, but a binaural beat he was playing to optimize the passenger's brainwaves. The real issue began when the passenger's phone rang. The driver immediately held up a hand, insisting their conversation would scramble the frequency and ruin the effect. The passenger complained they paid for a ride, not a forced audiotherapy session that just gave them a headache. 40. A writer in Boston complained about a driver who was a militant grammar purist. A small printed sign on the back of his seat read, "This is a slang-free vehicle." When the passenger mentioned something was cool, the driver interjected with, "I believe you mean it is satisfactory or pleasing." He would clear his throat loudly at any perceived grammatical error. The passenger felt like they were trapped in a car with their most judgmental high school English teacher. 41. This driver in Los Angeles wasn't just navigating streets. He was trying to score the emotional soundtrack of the ride in real time. The passenger complained that the driver had a small DJ controller on his dashboard and was actively mixing music based on the traffic. He'd play upbeat techno on the open freeway, transition to a somber piano piece for a traffic jam, and even dropped a dramatic musical sting when a pedestrian jaywalked in front of them. The complaint was that the constant mood-shifting music was giving them emotional whiplash. 42. A complaint from Las Vegas centered on a driver who provided unsolicited and, frankly, terrible life advice based on the passenger's shoes. The customer, wearing sneakers, was told he clearly lacked ambition and was afraid of commitment. The driver then spent the rest of the trip diagnosing the psychological profiles of other drivers based on their cars, concluding that anyone in a minivan had surrendered their dreams to a lifetime of juice boxes and soccer practice. The complaint? The shoe analysis was disturbingly accurate. 43. A writer in Philadelphia was held hostage by a riddle. The trip was perfectly normal until they arrived at the destination. The driver then locked the doors, turned around with a smug grin and said, "You may exit once you solve this. What has an eye, but cannot see?" The passenger, tired and just wanting to get out, immediately answered, "A needle." But the driver insisted they were wrong and forced them to sit in silence until they truly thought about it. The doors only opened after the passenger Googled the answer, which was, infuriatingly, also a needle. What's the dumbest test someone has ever put you through? 44. A passenger in Seattle filed a complaint for what they could only describe as an olfactory assault. The driver was apparently training for a competitive eating competition, and his chosen category was canned fish. For the entire duration of the ride, he was methodically eating his way through a flat of kippered snacks, pausing only to announce his personal best for herring and mustard sauce consumption. The passenger wrote that the smell was so profoundly awful, they considered just tucking and rolling out of the moving car. 45. This driver in Denver took safety to a paranoid new level. The passenger complained that the driver was wearing a full-face motorcycle helmet, padded racing gloves, and a high-visibility safety vest, all while driving a Toyota Camry at a painstaking 30 miles per hour on a clear sunny day. At every stop sign, he would perform a full 3-second head check in both directions, as if preparing for a Formula One race. The passenger felt like they were the safest and, simultaneously, the most ridiculous person on the road. 46. In a complaint from Dallas, a passenger reported that their driver was a passionate flat earther who spent the entire ride trying to use the moving car to prove his theory. He would point out the window and say things like, "See, the horizon stays perfectly flat no matter how fast we go. It never curves." The passenger just wanted a quiet ride, not a science lesson from an alternate dimension. 47. A passenger in Portland complained that the driver was a militant health fanatic who had upgraded his vehicle's amenities. The complimentary bottle of water offered to the passenger turned out to be the driver's homemade lukewarm kale and spirulina smoothie. He also periodically sprayed the car with a mist of what he called colloidal silver-infused air purifier. The passenger wrote they arrived at their destination feeling both hydrated and vaguely nauseous. 48. This complaint is about a fundamental misunderstanding of physics. A writer in Denver complained that the driver was stealing his gravity. He argued that every time the cab went over a hill and he felt that brief moment of weightlessness, the driver was somehow siphoning that gravitational pull for his own personal use later. He was dead serious, claiming he felt noticeably lighter and less anchored to the earth after the ride. He wanted compensation for his lost gravitational potential. 49. A tourist in Washington, D.C. complained that their driver provided a bizarre conspiracy theory tour of the city. He'd gesture toward the Lincoln Memorial and calmly explain it was a secret power hub for the lizard people. According to him, the White House's circular driveway was actually a vortex for controlling the media. The passenger just wanted to get to their hotel, but instead, they were treated to a full, unhinged lecture on the real history of the nation's capital. 50. A complaint from a talkative passenger in Boston described a driver with a strict "no small talk, only big ideas" policy. A sign on the seat read, "Weather, sports, and your day are prohibited topics. Philosophy, theoretical physics, and the nature of consciousness are encouraged." The passenger tried to comment on the traffic, and the driver immediately cut them off to ask, "But what is traffic really, if not a physical manifestation of our collective, uncoordinated desires?" 51. A complaint from a passenger in Miami described a driver who was a competitive relaxer. The entire cab was a sensory deprivation chamber on wheels. The windows were heavily tinted. A white noise machine was humming on the dashboard, and the driver wore a sleep mask perched on his forehead. He spoke in a barely audible whisper and drove at a speed so cautiously slow that a brisk walk would have been faster. The passenger complained that the ride was so profoundly uneventful and devoid of stimulus that it actually became stressful. 52. This one is an HR nightmare. A writer in a major city reported that their driver spent the entire ride conducting a full, unsolicited job interview with them. He had apparently seen on the app that the passenger worked in marketing and proceeded to ask a series of increasingly intense questions from "What's your 5-year plan?" to "Describe a time you failed and what you learned from it." The complaint was filed after the driver concluded the trip by saying, "You've got potential, but you're not quite what we're looking for right now." 53. A passenger in Boston filed a complaint about a driver who navigated using a deeply personal map of memories. Instead of street names, every turn was announced with some bizarre personal landmark. The ride was a stream of directions like, "All right, hang a left after the corner where I lost a $50 bet," followed by, "And now a sharp right at the bad first date intersection." The complaint wasn't that they were late. They somehow arrived with pinpoint accuracy. The problem was the passenger felt trapped in a live-action tour of a stranger's most random life events, and now their own mental map of the city was cluttered with completely useless, ungoogleable landmarks. 54. A complaint from New York City detailed a driver with a bizarre and oddly specific obsession: pigeons. He treated them like fellow drivers, giving them the right of way and even providing a running commentary on their behavior. "Oh, that's Frank," he'd say, pointing to a pigeon on the sidewalk. "He's got a temper. Best to give him some space." The final straw was when the driver came to a complete stop in active traffic to let a flock of pigeons finish eating a discarded piece of pizza, explaining that it was simply common courtesy. 55. A passenger in Las Vegas filed a complaint against a driver for shattering their reality. The ride was completely normal until the very end. As the passenger was getting out, the driver turned to them with a dead serious look and said, "None of this was real. You'll wake up soon." He then drove off, leaving the passenger standing on the curb in the desert heat, questioning everything about their trip, their life, and whether they were still asleep. The complaint? The sheer, unprovoked existential dread was not worth the $20 fare. This is 55 compelling reasons to just walk next time. But we all know these are just the stories that made it into an official report. The truly legendary, most unhinged encounters never become a formal complaint. Now it's your turn. We want to hear about your weirdest ride. That one driver, that one bizarre conversation you've never forgotten. Go down to the comments and share your own experience. If you enjoyed this deep dive into everyday absurdity, you know what to do. Hit that like button and subscribe for more.